Welcome to our webcast today. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to get started right away, and I'll make an announcement again at the end, but the recording will be available. For those who join later, they can go back and hear what we missed. So once again, welcome to our webcast. We're going to talk about a way to how to migrate from on-prem planning or native Essbase up to the EPM cloud. There's all these instructions on how to go from cloud to cloud. Like if I have PBCS and I want to go to enterprise or ePBCS to enterprise, we're not going to cover those. What we're going to cover is if I have an on-prem planning app or I have a native Essbase cube, how I can migrate that to the cloud and into the enterprise. And I am Ronnie Tafoya, and I am a planning regional manager with interRel. I have been working on planning since 1999, working with Hyperion Planning since it came out, got to watch it grow. And I'm currently on a project to migrate on-prem to the cloud. So I can give you some little gotchas as well that I have found along the way. A little bit about interRel. Our mission is to leave the world a smarter place than we found it. We really love to learn things, and we really love to teach what we learn, which is why we have these webcasts, which is why I'm going to give you some good tips and tricks for all the gotchas that I found so far, because I like to help educate people. A little bit about us: 5-time EPM Partner of the Year. It's a great company to work for. I work with some of the smartest people I know. We have some upcoming webcasts. Today is about migrating to cloud planning. We have a webcast coming up on how to migrate from HFM to FCC. We have another one on how to migrate from EDM from DRM or EPMA. And then we have our healthcare payer virtual conference coming up, which would be awesome for anyone in the healthcare industry as it relates to payers. It's a great series that we're doing because now is the time that people are starting to migrate from on-prem to the cloud. We're also offering a 3-day virtual strategic assessment. With all the uncertainty that's happening right now, we have put together a 3-day virtual assessment to help set your roadmap and help you to be able to account for the uncertainty in the economy and the industries right now because of this pandemic. It's a great product and experience, and we have the virtual strategic assessment down to a science and art. It's beautiful as well. Our standard disclaimer is these are steps that we follow, that it's from our own personal experience as well as what Oracle recommends, but we kind of tweak it sometimes based on what we find out in the real world. So that is what this presentation is about. And just as a mindset, these statistics come from our SOBA, which is the State of the Business Analytics survey that we do every year. And it basically shows that from 2018 to 2020, the number of companies that are going from thinking about moving to the cloud to planning to move to the cloud to actually moving to the cloud is increasing. So there's the idea of the cloud is more stable, the cloud is secure, we can move to the cloud, we can reduce all IT expense and all those things that are migrating people to the cloud. It's increasing, and we see it's only going to increase more and more and more as people and companies move to the cloud. So a quick decision tree: why would I move to the cloud? We've seen because leases on servers are going to expire, or I'm leasing space in a data center and I have to renegotiate the contract, and it's actually less money to move to a cloud environment. I had a client who projected a savings of $20 million a year moving to the cloud because Oracle manages all the hardware. If you have limited IT support, I actually worked on a client where we migrated to the cloud. This was in PBCS a few years ago because they wanted an Essbase cube. Their IT department wouldn't support that, so they went to the cloud so that they could have, you know, it was, at that time it was PBCS. They had 5 subscriptions, and they were able to have their Essbase in the cloud without IT support. They used the files that IT was willing to give them, and we created the application for them to do what they needed to do. Another reason you might want to move to the cloud is, are you going from Excel to a new solution? Then you could just go to the cloud, right? Something else is, if you were on-prem prior to 11.124, then you might want to move to the cloud to take advantage of all the features that the cloud has in addition to what 11.124 gave you. Because I know in 11.123, the planning utility was brought within the web browser. Planning 11.124 has more features. The cloud has even more. And then if you have compatibility issues between your systems, you could just migrate to the cloud. Quick little background. There's 2 versions of the current cloud licensing. There's standard, which it includes either planning or FCCS and things like that. We're focusing on planning. So if you have standard, what you get is the opportunity to use the modules in addition to one custom plan type. So if you're on-prem and you have planning, you get 3 plan types. If you enable capital, that gives you another one in addition to the 3. The same concept in the standard module is that you can have all the frameworks, workforce, capital, financials, projects, and strategic modeling, and then you get one custom BSO, one custom ASO. It's restrictive. You don't get a lot of the features that Enterprise has, but you can have, if it's a simple, you're going to use what out of the box gives you. You're not going to modify forms or anything like that. This might be a way to go. Personally, I recommend Enterprise because you have the freedom to do everything that standard does, but even within a modules for planning, you can use things like groovy rules that you can't use in standard. You can update a out-of-the-box form, which you can't do in standard. Well, you can update the form, but then the rule breaks. So there's a lot of restrictions on standard that Enterprise is more, Enterprise is closer to, if I bought planning on-prem and I wanted 5 applications, I could use Enterprise. That would allow me to create 5 applications. And just a little bit more between the 2, like I said, with standard, you get the frameworks. With Enterprise, you can have the frameworks, but notice that you also get 3 in this module base. You get 3 custom ASO, 4 custom ASO, 3 custom BSO, in addition to all the frameworks, whereas in standard, you just get 1. And then also in Enterprise, you can have custom, which is up to 12 apps. And what it does is, if the current client that I had, and we're going to have this in a subsequent slide, but in the current client, we actually took 3 planning applications and consolidated them into one custom app because we had the ability to have 6 BSOs. And right now we're using 5 out of the 6. So because their metadata and their refresh cycles were very similar, it's just that we could only have on-prem, you could only have 3 plan types. Now I can have 6. So I was able to merge 3 applications into one. And then you also have the ability to do freeform, which we're going to show briefly. And freeform is you are not bound by the planning dimension. So you don't need to have entity, scenario, version, year, period. You could just take an Essbase cube and move it up into the EPM environment. And there's a couple of ways to do that I'm going to show. And so that way you can have your Essbase cube in the cloud, and then you can use some of the planning features, like I could put a form on it. You can't do that in Essbase. You know, I could create valid intersections and all these things that you can do in planning, but it takes your Essbase outline and it creates the application without the restrictions of all the planning dimensions. Some of the things that you want to think about before you map out what your future looks like in the cloud is how many applications and plan types do you have? Because like I said, we combined 3 applications into one because it was the plan types that we needed. Are you using any out-of-the-box on-prem modules, right? Capital, PFP, Workforce, those will not migrate. If you have an application with that enabled, even if you don't use it, you have to do a different process to migrate. It's not a clean lift and shift. You can still go to the cloud. It's just not an LCM lift and shift, which is one of the options we're going to show. Do you have any ASO reporting cubes? Those you can bring into your planning application with, once again, that's not as clean of a lift and shift, but you can incorporate it into your planning application because you're allowed those 4 ASO plan types in a module and 6 ASO plan types in a custom. Or you could actually import it standalone again as a free form. But we had, what we did also at this current client is we took 2 native Essbase ASO cubes and we brought it into a planning application because once again, they shared metadata and refresh and security. So we brought the 2 into one planning application. Now, we have a BSO because when you create an application, you automatically get 1 BSO, 1 ASO, but that we're just ignoring right now. We could put our exchange rates in it and it'll push through. So there's different things that we can do. So you can think about what you have and where you want to go. And like I said, the things to consider are how often do you refresh your metadata? Do the security groups, are they similar between these applications? And we'll talk about shared services in a little bit. Do I have substitution variables? Are they set at server system variables? You can't have system variables in the cloud. They have to be application or database. What kind of data integrations are you doing? Are you doing data load rules? Are you using data management or FDMEE? Sorry, I was talking cloud. FDMEE. Are you using the planning load utility? How are you doing it? And then what are the existing artifacts that you have, planning and Essbase? Because on-prem, I can have an Essbase Calc script that runs from my planning app. In the cloud, Essbase is not there. So it's only the underlying engine. It's not like you have native Essbase to tie to your planning. So Calc scripts in planning have to be converted. We're going to talk about that as well. So these are some of the things that you want to talk about or think about and document and help make your roadmap. Some things to consider, like I said, the out-of-the-box on-prem do not migrate. You have to piece by piece migrate it. You can't just use an LCM. And the reason is because the frameworks in the cloud are different. They were redesigned. So especially Workforce was totally redesigned. So it won't really match. And on-prem, you had the option to really customize what you were doing. Like I said, our current client, they had Capital enabled on-prem, but they completely updated dimensions and that doesn't really work in the cloud anymore. So we had to migrate it separately and add to what we built. And so it can be a puzzle pieces that you're putting together, but you can get your environment up to the cloud. EPMA does not migrate. You have to convert that to Classic. Your home page, when you log in, all of that's gone because they use the simplified user interface, and so the interface is different. For shared services, in order to add users to the cloud, you have to have someone with identity domain administrator role. So even though you might be able to have the user's file, you wouldn't be able to incorporate it unless the account is an identity domain administrator as well. So that's something to keep in mind. And then shared services custom roles don't migrate either. Nothing in Essbase migrates per se. I put per se because there is a little caveat if you're doing a free form, but definitely global substitutions don't work because there's no concept of server-wide variables. Each application becomes its own server in a sense. So it's application or database. So you can do all apps or a specific, all databases or a specific database. You cannot change any of the settings, no cache, no buffer, no nothing. It's all managed by Oracle. Partitions don't exist in the cloud in EPM, so the partition definitions won't migrate. Essbase native reporting, so it's kind of like you have to do it a different way. So we'll talk about that, but it's just something to know. And then for reporting and analysis, annotations, batch jobs, general preferences, they don't migrate. There's two ways that you can migrate, really. Well, there's really three, but to migrate, there's the lift and shift, which for the current project I'm in, a couple of the applications were lift and shift. We just took it from on-prem, we did an LCM on-prem, we imported it into the cloud in Enterprise, and it created it automatically as a custom application. So it is possible. We didn't even change the names. Everything was as is. The only things that didn't migrate, once again, were all the Essbase, the load rules and the calc scripts. Those you have to convert. The second option is you can, what we call rebuild and migrate. So instead of doing an LCM import, you actually create the app and then you bring in pieces that you need, your metadata, your forms, any rules you have, business rules. You would bring those in piece by piece after you've created the application. If you, like I said, if you have out of the box on-prem capital workforce, you have to do it this way so that you can create the application and then you can bring the metadata in. You could even create a cube called CapEx. For example, if I had CapEx, at our current client, they had a CapEx cube, that's what they called it. We created a database called CapEx so that when we migrated metadata, it flowed through naturally because the name was already there. So you can do it. You just have to, you can't do an LCM import. You have to just import piece by piece. If you want to enable frameworks, you have to do this create and migrate because, like I said, if I take an on-prem LCM and I import it, it imports it as a custom plan type or a custom application. You cannot enable the frameworks unless it's a module application. So I'm going to show that as well, that you actually create an application as a module and then you can start bringing in your metadata and your other artifacts. And another good thing is if you don't want to import everything, like say I don't want to do all my forms, but IT only gave me a complete backup, then you could either import and ignore those forms, or you can just create the migration and then bring in the artifacts that you want. And I just want to say, we have a lot to go over, but if you have questions, feel free to enter it in the chat or the question and answer, and I will try to get to them. And I'm sorry for talking fast, but we got lots to get through. Okay, which application do you migrate first? So like I said, in the current environment we're in, although it's recommended you don't do everything at once, this company has a mandate to be in the cloud by the end of the year. So we have to do everything at once. But we're kind of using all these different methods. We did LCM of an application where we didn't want to change anything. We just needed it in the cloud. That would be a good one to start with, because then you could just do the import and then you can see what it gives you in the cloud, right? And you could start using some of the other cloud features that we're going to go over, but that would be a good candidate. Or if you know that you want to enable workforce and you want to use that, then it might be a good candidate to take the workforce piece, like your metadata, and then do the create the application as a module application, and then bring in your metadata and enable workforce and things like that. So there's a lot of ways to think about it. Very simple apps are always easiest to migrate. If you're only migrating part of an app and you want to see what it does in the cloud, you know, then there's ways to do that. Might be a good one. If you're bringing in a new company, then you would start with having them in the cloud first, and then you could add other companies and other processes as it matures. So there's lots of different ways that you can decide what to migrate first. Before you do any migration, my recommendation is, first of all, if you have an EPM planning app, convert it to Classic, because you can't migrate from EPMA, sorry. Oracle, I tell you. There's EPM Automate in the cloud and EPMA in on-prem. So sometimes and EPM is the name of the whole environment. And then convert any of your global substitution variables to application or database. And it might be redundant because if you have like current year as a server and you have 5 planning apps, you're going to have to add current year to each planning app. It'll make the migration easier, even though the prep work is a little more tedious. Could a customer upgrade core planning to 11.2 and move CapEx HSF to the cloud? I think this is a very, I will find out about 11.2. I know that you can migrate HSF to the cloud because there's a section I have in here on how to do that, to take your HSF and move it into strategic modeling. And I know that with 11.2, you can use the LCM. Once again, even with 11.2, I don't think that 11.2 is changing the on-prem modules to match what the cloud does, but I will verify that. Oh, they aren't supported in 11.2? Well, there you go then. So I should have read both comments. So you would, so I know HSF will migrate. The instructions say to migrate or to upgrade your HSF to 11.124. So you might want to do that before 11.2, or you can do pieces, right? You might not be able to, you can still update metadata. You might not be able to do a direct LCM, but you can do the pieces. And even if you couldn't use an LCM of your metadata, you can still export your dimension and then load it as a planning, upload of the dimension, because that functionality is the same. So there's ways to get your application from on-prem to the cloud. It's just some are more manual than others. Another thing that I would recommend is if you have calc scripts in your planning apps, convert them to business rules. You can do a copy paste. It's very, very tedious because you have to do a copy paste. You can't import them. Like if you have an Essbase application and you want to import calc scripts to be business rules, there's a function for that. That doesn't exist in planning. So you actually have to open up a new business rule, copy and paste your calc script into it. Then you can do, save it, and then you can always do a save as the next one, or so that you don't have to keep adding new ones. And we had one of our rules, I think we had 70 rules that we had to migrate. So you can migrate it beforehand to make your migration easier, or you can do it in the cloud because the process is the same. You have to copy the text of your calc script into a business rule. So the more you can do everything while you're still on-prem, the easier your migration will be. And the fact that business rules work on-prem, and then you could even use some of what Calc Manager allows you to do, like runtime prompts and scripts that are repeatable, so that it makes your business rules smaller and you have less points of update if your logic changes, So it's always, I'm learning to really, really appreciate Calc Manager. I came from Essbase. So I was an EAS, Essbase, Calc script person. And now I'm really starting to appreciate Calc Manager. I've even used it on Essbase cubes because, like I said, I had script that I had to run multiple times and I didn't want to change the logic in every business rule. So there's a lot of things you can do, but you're going to have to convert Calc scripts to business rules anyway. Some of the things that you're going to want to document are, well, if you have FDMEE, and you're going to use FDMEE once you migrate to the cloud, you can point to the cloud and you could just have another target. The only caveat to that is it can't be the same name as your on-prem app. So if you are going to eventually migrate your on-prem app to the cloud and you want FDMEE to feed both for an interim time, your cloud application name has to be different. And we kind of go through that too, how you can do that in a more systematic way. But that's one of the FDMEE caveats. The cloud comes with data management, which we call FDMEE Lite. It's the same process of how you would load data. It doesn't have all the features of FDMEE. Like one of my biggest pet peeves is you can't import period mappings. You have to create them. But once again, we had a workaround for that. Essbase load rules. Unfortunately, Essbase load rules are just kludgy, and you will have to go into each load rule, and you're going to want to document everything that you accept and reject, and your columns and your headers and your edits and all of that stuff you're going to want to document, because there's no way to pull it out of the load rule other than opening the load rule and clicking on everything. So definitely document that, because load rules don't exist in the cloud in EPM. You're going to have to migrate that to data management or some third party like OneCloud or something like that. So definitely document your load rules. And then if you have planning load utility loads, they will still work, as long as your dimension names are the same and your database is the same. So if you're changing your database or application name or your database name, you might have to update your planning load utility files to use the new database name. The same thing for exports. If you're exporting using an Essbase Calc script data export command, that works in the cloud, except that the target directory has to be specific to the cloud inbox, which there's lots of documentation on it. We have it as well, but you don't make that change until you're ready to go to the cloud. But exports still work. What doesn't work is CDFs. So our current client uses MDX export CDF commands to do their exports. That won't work. We had to migrate that to be either a Groovy script or a data management pool, which can export to a flat file. Report scripts don't work either. A report script you can convert to, if it's just a user needing the information, you can convert that to a SmartView query. If it's actually exporting to load to another cube or to load somewhere else, then once again, you're going to have to use either Groovy or data management or a third party like OneCloud or something. The planning export utility still works. And you can save them as jobs and things like that. So it's just, you're going to have to think about if you're exporting. Importing is kind of more limited. Exporting, there's more ways to get the data out. So you're just going to have to brainstorm as the best way to go about it. And then the other thing you're going to have to document is your automation. Oh, we're going to have to speed up. Is your automation, because you're going to have to use EPM automate commands in order to do things. MaxL commands don't work, so you can't use an import data MaxL command in a batch script. You have to change that to a run data rule EPM automate command. If you have a process where you would like zip up the directories and then download them, that is a download file snapshot, because in the cloud every night they do full backups. So you can download that full backup using an EPM automate command. Okay, and then SmartView. I'm going to kind of speed up through these. So SmartView, the bottom line is Essbase connections are gone. There's planning and planning ad hoc. So if you access your planning cubes using the Essbase connection and you do things like have member name and alias in separate columns, you're going to have to convert those before you go to the cloud, because you'll get an error if you try to retrieve. So the POV in the first row, that is a setting you can set, so that's allowed, but you can't have the member name and alias in separate columns, and it's just something to know. Okay, lift and shift. The LCM, this is what you're going to LCM from lift and shift. You're going to LCM your shared services. My recommendation is to do shared services as a separate LCM, because shared services is universal, and the groups that you get and the users you get are those who have access to all planning. But the way that the cloud works is if I have access to one planning app but not the other, then in the cloud I would be in one shared services for that planning app I have access to, and I wouldn't be in the other. So what I would suggest is you export shared services first, because then you can update like the groups and the users of who has what access, and then you could rezip them application specifically. And so that instead of trying to figure out for each application, having to export shared services for each app, just do it as one and then use that to move it. Also, I don't recommend importing users until you're ready to go. Because what happens in the cloud is when you add a user, they get an email. And if they get an email because you're migrating, but they don't really have access yet because you haven't tested it, then that's just confusing. Whereas shared services, they don't get an email. You tell them when they have access, right? So I recommend, Oracle says import users first, and I recommend importing users right before you're ready to start training because they will get an email, even if it's single sign-on. And it'll give them a link to their environment. And if they have access to multiple environments, they'll get multiple links. So that's a tip there. What you need for Calc Manager are basically everything in the Calc Manager. What you need for reporting and analysis is your sources, your POVs, all your repository. For planning, everything, you don't have to bring in user preferences because they can set them, and a lot of times if you're using frameworks or whatever, it's going to be different anyway. But this is what you need. You can LCM all your relational data. You can LCM everything from your plan type, your access groups in the planning security versus the groups in shared services. So this security is what members does this security group have access to. The shared services is what's the name of the security group. So that's why it's kind of both. And then in Calc Manager, it's what is the rule in Calc Manager. In planning, the Calc Managers are what has been deployed. So they are two separate things. And the first time I did a planning implementation, it took me a little while to figure that out. But the bottom line is you go to shared services on-prem, you create your LCM, and then you download the file. If you're in 11.124, you can just like click on it, right, and download. If you want to make any changes, you can unzip that file, edit the files that you want to change, and then rezip it. For shared services, I would suggest unzipping it unless every single group has access to every planning application on your system. If you only have one planning app, then you probably don't need to update your shared services group. But if you have multiples or shared services, that group, CSV also has users assigned to groups, and since you won't have users yet, you'll get an error. It's okay. There are errors that are fine when you migrate. Anything related to this user doesn't exist, I ignore those errors because they don't exist. I haven't added them yet, but it won't stop the application from building. So this is really just saying that if you use Notepad++, it's kind of my editor of choice, that you can create the changes there. You have the opportunity to bring every file in, and then you can do a change that says replace all in all open. So if you wanted to change your application name because you're FDMEE, then you could bring every file from your LCM into Notepad++. You could change, you could search for the old app name, put in the new app name, and replace in every form, and then you just save it all, and then, because there's a save all as well, and then you can rezip it. So it doesn't have to be tedious, but it is manual. And just things like, remember that you want to, every instance, if you are going to open the files one at a time, every instance you're going to have to do that search and replace, and make sure also you replace the directory names, because it looks, the LCM actually looks, that tells it what application, what database you're in, right? So change your directory names. If you have data, change your data file, and then you just rezip it up. Now, where you rezip it up is when you extract all your data, it creates like a top directory. And in that top directory, you're usually going to have, this, I only LCM shared services, so that's what it would look like. If you had multiple, you might have multiple directories in there. That's the level you want to zip. So in essence, you're creating a zip file in the directory that you exported your zip file from. Because if you try to go to the same level that your zip file was in, you'll get an error. You have to be here where I see my directories and I see that import export, and that's where you zip up. Now, in order to import it, so the first thing you do is you log in, and this is what you're going to see. If it's a brand new environment, you might have to choose planning, because like I said, in enterprise, you have planning, you have profitability, you have narrative reporting, you have consolidations. So you're going to have to choose planning. And then once you choose planning, you're going to choose Migrate, because we're going to upload our LCM. So when you choose migration, well, you choose Migrate, it takes you to the Migration tab, and then you choose Snapshot, and you can upload your file. And then once you've uploaded your file, you can click on the 3 little dots and import. So if you're doing a direct lift and shift, and you're not, and you don't have to enable frameworks for everything, knowing that when it creates the application, it will create it as a custom app, then you just import it and you let her rip. And then when it's all done, if there are any errors, you look at the errors. If you have a fatal error, because sometimes it'll say failed, but it says failed, like I said, because user preferences weren't added. That's fine. If it said that it couldn't refresh your database, that's a problem, because when you import, it does a database refresh as part of the process of creating the application. So if you get an error that your database couldn't refresh, then you have a problem. But things like if you had calc scripts or load rules in your LCM, you'll get errors that is not supported at this time, but it's okay. So you have to look at the errors and then go through them and address what's really an error versus what's more of a warning error. So then once you have migrated, because load rules aren't available, you're going to have to do your integration. You're going to have to create your data management. You have to create your source, your target, all of that fun stuff. One of the things that when you do an import, if you create an application from scratch, it creates some out-of-the-box data management artifacts, including period mapping based on the start and end year and start and end month that you set up when you create the app. If you do it as an import, that doesn't happen. So one of the things that we've done in the past is create an application and then LCM the data management mapping, remove that application, and then import. Because when you create an application, you don't have to create any dimensions. It just builds it with the, out-of-the-box dimensions. But it will give you some of that data management information, like the period mapping. So then I create a snapshot of the period mappings. I save it on the server because you don't have to download it. And then I remove the application. I click on Migrate. I import my application, and then I import my data maps. My period mapping. So you don't have, because otherwise you have to manually. And if you have 10 years in your planning app times 12 months, that's a lot of manual effort that you have to do. So that's just a little trick to get around that. And then the other things about automation and security that you could read while I was talking. And then validate and test. Validate that your data loaded correctly, validate that new data can be loaded correctly, because, with data management, you can drill through, right? But you can't drill through when you've imported your data on a creation of the database, because it's in the Essbase cube, it's not in data management, right? So you're still going to have to set up your validation of your process for loading data. You're going to validate the functionality, make sure there are limitations in enterprise to calc scripts. Like you cannot use lock block. I don't think you get an error if you have a set lock block. If you have set create on missing block, that has to be within a fixed statement. You can't just have it as a set outside of the fix. So that's the things you have to, even though you might have imported your Essbase calc scripts into business rules, when you move to the cloud, there are additional restrictions that on-prem business rules don't have. On-prem just runs Essbase, but Oracle has put limitations on the cloud for performance issues. So that's one of the things that we've had to go and actually validate every rule that we copied from calc script to a business rule, and then run a validation until we got familiar with what wasn't allowed in the cloud, like remote calcs turned on and all these cache settings. So that's just something to know when you migrate and then you're testing. And it's something that you're probably going to find out when you're validating the cloud. And then you're going to add users. So you can there's different ways to add users. You can do them one by one. You can upload the user sheet. You can automate it using EPM Automate so that you can get the CSV file and add. So whoever's logging in has to have that identity domain administrator role in order to create users. And then once you have the user, you give them a role, and the role is planner. Unfortunately, it's a three-step process. You add the user, you give the user a role of either user or power user or service administrator, and then once they have access to that instance, because when you give them the role, you give them a role of like user EPM or user EPM test. Those are two different environments. When you give them a role, the role is assigned to that instance. And then once they have the role, you can add them to your security group in planning. So once you've added all your users, then you can do your training and your rollout, right? And if you've decided that you want to use some of the planning features like navigation flows or dashboards, then you can show them that as well, right? When it's time to roll out. And here's a link that is it's the step-by-step guide. Like I said, there are some things that I think are not as clear, but as you go through it, you'll catch it. And it says to migrate security first, and I disagree. I migrate groups, yes. Migrate people last. So if you want to use the frameworks in the cloud, then you can't do an LCM lift and shift, because once again, I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but if you LCM, it creates a custom application. If you want frameworks, you have to have a module application. So the two options you have is create the app, enable the frameworks, and then bring in your artifacts, or create the app, bring in your artifacts, and then create the frameworks. And it's just kind of it is preference. If you were doing like what we had to do where we did a CapEx, we brought it into a custom, so we were fine. If we were going to use the CapEx out of the box cloud module, then I would probably would have enabled CapEx so that you get because you get different dimensions that get added, and they have parents, and we'll talk about that in another slide. And then you have to bring your metadata under the out-of-the-box parent. So I'd probably enable the frameworks first. But if you have a module application that you don't know if you want to use module, so you're just going to bring in your custom plan types, then definitely you could create the application, then you can migrate everything but the design of that application. So all your metadata, forms, rules, all of that comes through. And then it's just the custom plan types within a module application. The issue is, if I had PBCS, that would be like my idea of a custom, and then I could enable ePBCS and then have frameworks. You can't do that in enterprise. It's two different applications. So I can create a module application and then import all my artifacts from my on-prem, and I'm fine. And then I can enable frameworks later. And then you might have to move things around, or you might have to copy. We kind of have some slides about how when you enable frameworks, it gives you scenario inversions. So if I already have an actual scenario and I enable financials or workforce, I'm going to get an OEP _ actual. So there's going to be a step to copy all my actual data to that member and delete my member. So there are things that you have to do if you have metadata and then enable frameworks. But if you ever want to enable a framework, then you're going to have to create it, and then you can just migrate everything in it. And we kind of talked about that scenario. So when you enable frameworks, the out-of-the-box members always have an OEP _ for common, like scenario version. For specific to the framework. Like if I'm enabling financials, my out-of-the-box members will have an OFF underscore. My workforce will have WP underscore or WF underscore. So there's framework-specific out-of-the-box prefixes, and then there's the generic out-of-the-box prefix, like I said, for scenario and version. And then these are just some of the other things that you have to do if you're going to turn a custom module into enabling frameworks. So if I'm going to create a module, then I follow the same LCM steps, except I wouldn't bring in the configuration properties because you're going to create it anyway. And then if you want to rename database names and all that, you can follow that same unzip and edit. So now the difference is when I log into planning, instead of migrate, I'm going to click on create a new application. And then I'm going to choose modules because, like I said, you have those 3 types of enterprise applications you could choose. And then you're going to set all this, right? So this is kind of the same thing as when you're doing an on-prem application. The thing is, in the cloud, you get 1 BSO and 1 ASO every time you create an application, and you have to give them a name. The default for the BSO is Plan 1, just like on-prem. The default for the reporting cube is the name of the application. So you can change that if you want. You can enable sandbox because sandboxing is allowed in your custom plan types. And then you create your application, and then it would look like that. And then you can add custom dimensions. You can import everything, like I said, and then you can enable your different frameworks. And then here's an example of what happens. So you see in this outline, we enabled workforce, and now you can see OWP. I'm sorry, I had the wrong prefix. OWP means that it's workforce planning, Oracle Workforce Planning. And so you can see where it has the no account. It has, if you had any of your hierarchies, it would be there, but then it adds these out-of-the-box members. The same thing in your entity dimension. So when you enable a framework, you get these out-of-the-box. Notice it says OEP because an entity is across all plan types. So it's an OEP underscore, and that means that no matter which plan type you're in, even your custom plan types now, you can use that OEP total entity because you're going to want it to match your workforce entity, right? And so in this instance, we had an entity dimension that was created that we had org1 and org2 under our dimension. And then we enabled workforce, and it creates this total entity parent. And then you have to actually move your hierarchy under the new parent in order to be able to use it for workforce. And this is what I was talking about with scenario, is that it would create their own scenarios. And the reason it creates this is because when you enable a framework, it gives you rules and forms and substitution variables and valid intersections, meaning in this scenario, I can only write to these periods for these accounts and things like that. So it has to use the names that they know. So you're going to have some duplicates. And if you notice, I have OEP actual with an alias of actual, and then I have an actual member. So it's allowed, but when you try to use Smart View and you're using alias, it would say that you were vague or there's some kind of weird error because basically your actual alias is the same as this alias. And so if you're doing member name, it would be fine. But anyway, bottom line is you would have to write a rule to copy, or you could use the copy utility to copy from actual to OEP actual and then delete actual, and do the same thing for plan and forecast if that's what you're using. Or in this instance, budget, I would have to copy budget to plan and then delete budget. So there are some things that you have to take care of if you have a custom that you are converting to use frameworks. It's just things to be aware of. Okay, and just some other things. So if I have a custom dimension like location, and I want it in my financials but not in my workforce, but it already exists because it's in my custom plan type, that's fine. You don't have to use every dimension when you enable frameworks. And if you need a dimension that's not in any of your custom plan types, like I plan financials by location, but I plan workforce by geography, then you could create a custom for workforce about geography and just ignore that location. So when you import your remaining artifacts, once your dimensionality is there and you want to bring in forms and so on and so forth, now instead of logging in, there is a migration that you can get to by clicking on Tools, Migration, and then Snapshots. And then you would upload the snapshot, and then you would import. You could expand what it is, and you could just import what you want to import. So this is Freeform. So what Freeform is, like I said, it allows you to bring in an Essbase cube into the EPM environment without being restricted by the planning dimension. So when I talked about in the beginning migrating or creating an Essbase cube for a customer that didn't have any IT support, the only thing available then was to create a reporting application, which was still a planning app. It was just an ASO planning app, and it still had the planning dimensions of scenario and version and year and month, and they didn't need all that, but they had to have it. So what Oracle did is they created this idea of Freeform so that I can bring in this instance, I'm going to bring in sample basic, and sample basic is going to come in without period and year, right? Because in sample basic, my months roll up to quarters, roll up to year. I don't have this concept of what year it is, but this allows me to just bring in the entire application. And there's a couple of ways you can do it. There's really 3 ways, but we're migrating. So we have the outline already. We have the application already. So the 2 ways that you can do it that way is you can use your OTL. So you just download your outline, and then when you log into planning, you create a new application, and this time you're going to create Freeform. And then you're going to choose this option of import Essbase outliner or LCM. If you have a reporting cube, and this is if you were already in planning, you had the option of PBCS standard, an ePBCS, or a reporting cube, and the reporting cube created one ASO database. You could migrate that ASO cloud app into this Freeform, or you can use the import of the OTL, or you can actually even use a wizard to build it, but we're not going to do that. We're going to use the outline. So you just import the outline, and then you click create, and it knows, based on your outline, it knows whether it's a BSO or an ASO. And then it's going to create your application. And then this is what it looks like. So you've created your application. It's our sample basic. And this is what the dimensions look like. Notice there's no scenario, or there is scenario, but there's no version. There's not 2 different dimensions to split out years. That's using the OTL. So if you had an ASO and you don't have any rules running against that ASO, then you might want to just use the OTL. The other way that you can migrate on-prem is you can actually create an LCM of your Essbase app. Now, the cool thing about this is, especially if you have a BSO, if you have a BSO app that has a Calc script in it, it will convert that Calc script to a business rule for you. I don't know why it doesn't do it for planning yet, but it will do it for Essbase. So if you have an Essbase app that you want to convert to Freeform, you don't have to convert your Calc scripts. It will do it for you. So then you would just LCM your Essbase. Just don't bring in any custom defined functions or macros, because that won't work in the cloud. But you can have your configuration, your database with all the artifacts in that database. Your, you know, if you have, well, Calc scripts, load rules wouldn't convert, but that's okay because it kind of ignores it. But then you could just LCM that, and then once again, log into planning, click create. Then you're still going to use the Freeform, except this time you're still using the import, but now you're importing a zip file instead of an OTL file. So it has everything. And then it does the same thing and it creates the application. The difference is, so the dimensions are the same. It knows what's dense based on your outline. The difference is if you go into Calc Manager, it now has that Calc script that's been converted to a business rule. So that's kind of cool if you're just doing an Essbase application to be able to migrate it. The limitation is you can only have one database in a free-form app at this time. So if you have a BSO application with 4 databases, you would probably have to use the outline method because you can only bring in one data. So each database would be its own application. Okay, last thing, and then we have 5 minutes. So if you have questions, feel free to email them and we will get you the answers because I don't think I'm going to have time for question and answers. Thank you for letting me talk so fast. Once again, we're going to, the recording will be available. Unfortunately, I don't think you can slow down how fast I talk, but you can watch it over and over as you're going through this process. So to migrate strategic or HSF into strategic modeling. Strategic modeling can be enabled in either a module application or a custom application, which is a beautiful enhancement that it came out in August of 2020, which is to allow strategic modeling in the custom. Because once again, custom gives me 6 BSOs, 6 ASOs, and now strategic modeling. So our current project, one of the applications that was by itself was for strategic modeling. It was an HSF source cube. And we had to have a module application just so we could have strategic modeling. But now that they enabled it in custom, that's one of the cubes that we were able to migrate 3 applications into one. So you can, from 11.124, migrate from HSF by saving your files into local files. Then when you're in the cloud, you create an application. So it's not like you can import like you can with your planning LCM, because HSF or strategic modeling is really like a database that lives outside but connected to planning. So what you would have to do is create an application, either custom or module, and then you could enable strategic modeling. So if you did an LCM and you just went straight into importing that LCM into a custom, you could then enable strategic modeling and then bring in your strategic modeling artifacts. So once you have enabled strategic modeling, then you can create your models using your local files, either through the web or through Excel, and then you build your consolidation. So it's kind of, and here's a link on how to do that. And that's the, if you search for that, Migrate Strategic Finance to Strategic Modeling, it'll bring you to that link. So it does more of a step-by-step, but that's the gist of how you would migrate your on-prem HSF into the cloud. I have 2 minutes. So just quickly going through, these are some of the things that are available in the cloud. You have navigation flows, you have smart forms, which is really cool. They're going to enable smart forms for what they call the standard ad hoc, which will be nice because that's where that POV on the first line comes in. And then you can do a smart push, which means from a form, you can push directly to another cube. It doesn't even have to be a reporting cube, because I know on-prem you can, set up push to a reporting cube. This can go from cube to cube. So you just can't do a smart push to itself. So smart pushes are based on data maps, which have a source and a target. Right now, that target can't be the same as a source. But Groovy can do that. So Groovy is available in the cloud. And you have dashboards. And really quick, with 1 minute left, EAS is gone. What we did is we complained that we needed EAS functionality, and they gave it to us. They gave a lot of it to us, other than what we can't control, in Calc Manager. So, and it's also available on Calc Manager on-prem, But if you click on this little icon or you go to Action and click Database Properties, that takes you to basically EAS. So you can look at sessions, you can kill long-running, you know, if you're testing something, you can kill long-running sessions through EAS now, well, Calc Manager. You can start and stop applications and databases. You can see statistics on your database, what is your dimensions, more like what EAS shows you, the properties. It'll tell you how many page and index files you have. It'll tell you when, you know, the application, the outline has been modified. And you can also do things like restructure your database. You can do it from the regular web app, or you can do it by hand here in Calc Manager. You can run a verify outline, you can clear data. So all of this database stuff that you can do, including importing and exporting level 0 data in BSO and ASO, is available. Okay, so that's it. And I just finished. So if you have any questions, like I said, email us. If you want to see videos, we have a lot of Play It Forward videos, epm.bi/videos on how to do things, enabling frameworks, and a lot of different processes for the cloud especially. And we also have our library of books that can help you understand Essbase, planning, the cloud, so on and so forth. So, whew. Thank you for joining me on this roller coaster ride. We got through it. We're back in the roller coaster wheelhouse. Woohoo! And I appreciate you spending this time with me. I hope you got some good information. I know it's a lot. Like I said, you can request the recording and then you can watch it again and pick apart the pieces. If you have questions, feel free to email and we'll get you the answers. And I just thank you very much. And have a great rest of your day.